back, America. It's Hugh Hewitt, joined now by Admiral James Stavridis, retired United States Navy. The four-star admiral has served in a lot of different jobs, including commander of U.S. Southern Command, Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, and commander of your attention whenever he shows up here. Good morning, Admiral. How are you? Still in Florida?
I am down here, Hugh, and looks like another beautiful day. Might head out to the beach when I'm done with a lot of phone calls and Zoom meetings.
Well, Admiral, did things settle down in Florida as they appear to have? By settled down, I mean protests are fine. There have been some big ones across the United States. There were in Washington yesterday. But I believe the violence has subsided. Is that your impression?
That is my impression, and that's enormous good news for the country. The last thing in the world we need on top of the COVID is a series of violent protests, looting, breakdowns of law and order. I understand the reason for the protests, and I am supportive of people pressing on the policing system in the country. We've got to get that right. We can never see another video like we saw coming out of Minneapolis and the death of George Floyd. But we have to maintain order in the country. I think we can do that effectively. But Hugh, here's the point. We're right in the middle of this COVID situation. We can't take our eye off that ball.
Admiral, I want to talk to you about command environment. Yesterday, I had on Senator Martha McSally, Colonel, retired from the United States Air Force, and she entered into a couple of command environments where there was just out of control sexual harassment. She details it in her new book, Dare to Fly. I'm going to talk with Joni Ernst, another National Guard veteran. But both of them have said in their book, everything depends upon the people at the top. When you see a police department with rogue officers, do you immediately think there is a problem in the command environment somewhere?
Absolutely. And let's face it, when you walk aboard a ship, let me put this in a nautical context. When you walk aboard a ship and you walk around for 30 minutes, you can get an immediate feeling of command environment. And it's from kind of big things like how you're greeted, how the quarterdeck looks, to the small things like is there dirt in the corners of the mess decks? It's the little things. We saw that as changes in policing really turned around safety in New York City. First of all, a fish rots from the head. You got to worry about the top of the leadership in that situation. And then secondly, there's a peer pressure aspect to this as peers look across the organization. And if they see slackness or not following the rules, you're going to see a gradual degradation of the environment. So the answer to the question is yes.
So I want to stick on that for just a moment because I think this is actually directed to every police chief in the United States. And there are thousands of them because the police power resides with the states. People don't understand the federal government does not have a general police power. The police power resides with the states. It is delegated in turn to local governments, county and sheriffs and excuse me, Admiral, you know the Beltway is not good to people with asthma and allergies. Anyway, the state and local police authorities have this power. How does a commander establish that the use of force is always proportionate, never lethal, unless your life is in danger? Because that's what L.A. had to get to after the L.A. riots. I covered it for 10 years, every night on Life and Times. Every night we covered police power issues. And the reform process wasn't easy out there. It took 3 police chiefs, maybe 4, to get to where we wanted to get in Los Angeles. It's not easy to establish.
It's not. And let's just do the numbers for a second. There's somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million law enforcement officers in the United States when you count reservists, auxiliaries, and active duty out there. So that's really the size of the U.S. Department of Defense. But here's the problem. You just pointed it out. It's broken down into 50 states, 3,000 counties, and tens of thousands of municipalities, each one of which, just look at the uniforms of them. Each one of them, I hate to use the word uniform because there's nothing uniform about it. And look at how some police chiefs wear like 5 stars on their collar. They might have 100 people working for them, but they're like a 5-star admiral. And some police chiefs have more modest. It's just all these different organizations have different cultures, different histories. They've gone through different situations. So the real challenge when we say we want to create a policing culture in the nation that is everything you just said it needed to be. The problem is it's broken down into all of these individual elements. And the reason for that is the founding fathers did not want, justifiably, I believe, a huge national police force. They didn't even want a big standing army, by the way. The Congress has the power to raise an army and maintain a navy. So what can we do about it? We can take what we've learned, I think, in the Department of Defense and apply it, which are the things we just talked about, focus on culture, get the right leaders in place. You mentioned it. Sometimes you got to go through a number of leaders to get to the one you actually need. We've got to resource it properly. And here I mean the training, the time to get these officers off the front lines, get them the training they need, certify them. And lastly, you've got to ruthlessly weed out the bad apples early on. And I think, to close, I think we're going to find out that the particular police officer who sat with his knees on the neck of George Floyd in public view with brother officers around him, we're going to find that was not the first time he started violating norms and rules. He should have been thrown out much sooner. That's got to be part of it as well.
Well, we agree on everything. I don't know if we're going to agree on this. Yesterday, Mayor Bill de Blasio gave a statement that I think is going to rank as one of the most irresponsible and dumb things I've heard an elected leader say. He said, look, we're not going to have the National Guard in or military people, even though, I mean, New York had been overwhelmed on successive nights for 4 nights because they don't know how to do the job that the New York police are trained. They don't know our city. The last thing you need, history shows, and he proceeded to misstate history. History shows that violence always follows when the military is involved. That actually is not true. It's the exact opposite in L.A. in 1992, the one example with which I'm very familiar because I was covering that from the streets. What do you think? Do you think the military, when used under the Insurrection Act, is trained appropriately to secure large spaces? They don't actually do the policing. They provide force enlargement positions. What's your thought about that?
Again, let's do the numbers here. As I said, there's 800,000 to 1 million law enforcement officers, civilians. There are 500,000 National Guard troops. The National Guard is the correct answer here. Those forces are, we say in the military, Hugh, you know this expression, they're chopped. That means we take their authorities out of the national system and we place them under the governor of the state. That's an appropriate use of military force, and these are military members who wear military uniforms who are trained within the military, but they're specifically trained for these kind of missions. I think that is a correct solution when local law enforcement loses control of a situation. And I think we have sufficient forces in those million law enforcement officers and those 500,000 National Guard personnel to handle any foreseeable situation I can see arising. So I don't see the need to dip into active duty troops to bring them in under the Insurrection Act. I'm a much bigger fan of Posse Comitatus, which was passed around the same time in the 19th century, which is what precludes active duty military from conducting law enforcement operations. So let's use the National Guard. Let's use it smart. They're local. They're connected to the local communities. They ought to be under the authority of the governor. That's the way we ought to approach this.
Yeah, that's what struck me about de Blasio. I think the federal troops are necessary in places like Little Rock. They're necessary maybe in Washington, D.C., where the overwhelming security concerns are for continuity of government. But for Bill de Blasio to say the National Guard can't come here because they're not trained, in fact, they are trained. I just thought it was the dumbest. They're very, very good at what they do. And people say Kent State, which was an unfortunate, terrible tragedy 50 years ago, but has the Guard changed in 50 years, Admiral Stavridis?
Oh, my gosh. And much better trained, much better equipped. And don't forget, that was part of a draft system, a conscription system. Let's face it, you and I don't have to criticize Mayor de Blasio on that statement. He was criticized by his fellow Democrat and the governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo, who said, you know, if I need to, I will bring in troops. He was talking about Guard troops. And I hope the New York Police Department, which has a very proud history, and by the way, has 50,000 people in it. I mean, this is a big entity. It's like one of the largest armies in the world. They can do this. But if we need to bring in the National Guard to help them, then we should do that. Absolutely.
Last question. John Podhoretz yesterday was afraid that the Upper West Side and the Upper East Side were going to burn because it was Brooklyn, followed by Wall Street, followed by Midtown. It looked like demonstrators, but it stopped last night. I think because of the president's statement, the clear communication of that, and Andrew Cuomo's statement that this was not going to be tolerated anymore. In terms of what the National Guard do, under whose command are they when they deploy, for example, in Los Angeles in the aftermath of the 92 riots or during the 92 riots? They were out during the worst of it. Under whose command are they, Admiral?
They would be under the governors of the state. They're chopped again from the national authority to the governors of the state. That's a very sensible and well-trodden path. The only time I can think of where federal troops were brought in was during race relations in segregation to enforce integration in schools, because the local troops and the local governments were not going to take that on. And I'm glad they went in when they did. So there might be some other use for them. But again, the model here is use the National Guard, keep it under the governors. That's the way we're going to maintain order, and that's how we're going to have peaceful protests. And we need those peaceful protests. They are the center of gravity of what's happening right now. The overwhelming majority of those protesters are peaceful. Frankly, our police officers and our National Guard ought to be protecting them while they conduct peaceful protests. That's the path out of the situation we're in now, Hugh.
1 minute, Admiral. Do you think our adversaries are taking advantage of this? Certainly, the CCP has been flooding our social media with propaganda to try and equate the Hong Kong demonstrators and the violence in the United States.
Absolutely. And I would put China and Russia at the top of the list, using a wide variety of social media, subtly, cleverly. We have to suss that out, and we have to call it out, and we have to rise above this moment. And we can do this. We've been here before. We will come together as a nation. We need to do that.
Admiral James Stavridis, retired United States Navy. Thank you, Admiral. Always a pleasure to speak with you. Hey, America.